Well, ladies and gentlemen, another, I would say, pretty good race. Not maybe quite to the standard of Canada, which was just a wow, but still a decent quality race. Good passing, great strategy. In fact, from a strategy standpoint, I think it was one of the better ones. People had to do a lot of thinking, a lot of planning, fair amount of experimentation, in my opinion, because there are quite a few variables based on the surface and the tires. But overall, Canada, I think, was better. But this is still very good. In fact, I'd argue that the last few races we've had have significantly lifted the profile of F1. People have been making heavy weather about it being boring and all of that. Mind you, I mean, I'll probably be a little not necessarily controversial, but I'll insert my personal opinion here that a lot of that is driven by the British media and to probably a wider extent the Hamilton fan base because Verstappen is winning and Red Bull is winning and that doesn't sit well with a lot of people. And so I think the whole stress on Formula One has been a bit exaggerated by the media from that perspective. But nobody can argue the last few races. There have been very good races, and I said it a couple of times, but I'll say it now emphatically because we must be careful when we look at one or two race performances in Formula One, especially in a 24 race season. Not to get carried away with a snapshot scenario. Look at the big picture and look at trends. And I think for the past 5 races, we have definitely seen a trend. There is no doubt that the Red Bull is no longer the dominant car. In fact, not only is it no longer the dominant car, in several of those instances, it's not even the fastest car. Mercedes had their measure in Canada. Russell, for all intents and purposes, Russell should have and could have won in Canada. Similarly, Norris should have and could have won today. I mean, not today, but for this race, for Spain in Barcelona. So the racing is definitely closing up, as is expected by anyone who knows about Formula One and understands how technical regulations work. That there is inevitably a convergence of a few teams at the top when rules are kept constant for a period of years. And that's what we're seeing here. Everybody else is essentially catching up to Red Bull, whereas Red Bull, having already gotten it right, have much less room to develop. So that's essentially what we see playing out, and it will probably be even worse or better, depending on how you look at it, in 25 until the regulation changes. So back to the race itself. Good race, Verstappen winning again, and this time you can't really fault his drive. I mean, I made a Facebook post and I called him the Max Terminator. And the reason I use that expression is because, like in the Terminator movies, where, in one of the scenes, the woman, I can't remember her name now, was saying, he doesn't make mistakes, he doesn't feel emotion, he doesn't cry, he doesn't feel pain, he just is relentless. Bam, bam, bam. That in certain ways is indicative of how Max was operating in this race. And in fact, I had made that point in Canada as well, that Max won mainly because he made less mistakes than the others. And again, we see it here. There's no question that this race was lost by Lando, not necessarily won by Max. McLaren could have had this race. They should have had this race. And but for a poor start, I hear people talk about some pit strategies as well, and maybe a couple other little variables. But the reality is, if Lando had gotten a better start and had been able to control the race from the beginning, I think we'd have seen a different outcome. But the fact is, he didn't. He made a poor start. Verstappen got up beside him. He, as in he, Lando, was very aggressive, pushed Verstappen right off. I mean, he was in the grass. But to his credit, he didn't lift, maintained the pace, and we'll get to what Russell did in a second. But in terms of Lando and Max, really held his nerve, made the pass cleanly. I think Norris recognized that he could not effectively block him without probably taking himself out, and had to concede the place. I also think by the time they got into the corner, the first corner itself, and Russell was around them, it probably took Norris a little by surprise to see Russell on his left when he was focusing so much on Verstappen on his right. So I think that might have also kind of slightly discombobulated him a bit, and it allowed Verstappen to get into second. So that was a really exciting start, no question about it. Thereafter, another key move by Verstappen, and back to the kind of perfectionist and aggressive but controlled aggression, is how quickly he was able to catch and pass Russell. The importance of that cannot be overstated. That he didn't use up his tires is not just a time loss. Yes, there's a time loss if you're a faster car stuck behind a slower car. Obviously, that's a factor. But perhaps more crucially in this current era of Pirellis, where the tire, the degradation and the drop-off is so vital to how you plan your race strategy, that he was able to quickly pass Russell, put on a gap, and then control his tires, the temperature and the degradation for that stint to build up a gap is can't be understated. And you can contrast that with the second thing that happened to Norris immediately thereafter, which is having lost the place to Verstappen, which is the first thing. When he also, being also a faster car than the Mercedes, when he eventually caught up to Russell, I think it took him about 12 laps or more to pass Russell. I think it was like 13 laps or 14. I don't remember how long exactly now, but he was behind Russell for several laps. So he lost all that time, but crucially, he used up all of his tires. And those things play a crucial role. Now, you may not necessarily classify... You certainly can classify the start as a mistake. Would you classify not passing Russell quickly as a mistake? Maybe not. But the fact is, if you have a faster car and you are a good driver, at least comparable to Russell, if not a little superior, you might have to look at it as a mistake at that level. At this level of sport, that's essentially a mistake. If you can't push past your competitor quickly and effectively and go on and chase the next man ahead who you're really racing, then you have to say that that's an error. And he definitely couldn't. I mean, it was remarkable and kind of funny too when you heard Lambiase, which is Max's engineer, said, okay, when you're behind Russell, you have to pass him now. And his answer was like, okay. And lo and behold, there's the pass. I mean, that's impressive. For somebody like me who is so into it, these little things are the things that kind of that separate the good from the great. Because as I keep making this point, all of these guys are good. Even the worst one, even Sargent, then for example, or Stroll or whatever. They're not bad drivers. They're just not as good as the guys at the very top. And that's really things like that are the differentiating factors, that decisiveness, that aggressiveness, that precision, that consistency. I'm going to stick with Max a little bit before we move on, because I think it's worthy. I'm on record as saying I'm not really a fan of his per se, but I'm becoming one. I have to confess, I am becoming a Verstappen fan. When I look at the last, when I subscribe to all the feeds and I get the data streams. And when you look at the lap time data, if you look at Max's last 10 laps, like 57 to 67 or whatever it worked out to be, the last 10 laps that he did were all 10. So there are no anomalies. All 10 laps consecutively were within 200ths of a second of each other. Now, it almost doesn't seem possible that somebody can do that. But particularly at the end of a race, when you're on soft tires, so you're at the end of the useful life of the tire, right? And you're under massive pressure from a man who is behind you in a faster car and is closing the gap little by little by little. For you to have, and your engineer is in your ear saying, pick up the pace, Lando is catching you. He's not watching his tires, he's pushing, he's catching you. Combining all of those things, and you have the presence of mind and the ability to control yourself so much that you're able to look at the gap that you have to the man behind you, look at the amount of laps left, and control your pace so that you finish still with a gap. It's down to 2 seconds, but still a reasonable gap, right? And not try to do anything stupid. You don't try and burn up the tire. You don't try and push too hard to make a mistake. Nothing. You're so consistent within 200ths of a second of each lap for 10 laps straight till the end of the race. I'll tell you that is not an insignificant achievement. That speaks to a mental toughness and a concentration level and an ability to focus and execute a task. The word relentless comes to mind. He has a relentless aspect to his character. He's like this immovable force. And the fact is that if you want to beat him, you can't just be faster than him. Because Norris was faster. Consistently, in all 3 stints, Norris was essentially the faster car. But you have to be a total package to beat him. You can't make mistakes. If you make even the slightest error, the slightest sliver of an error, you're dead. It just destroys you. And that's really serious. That's his strength. And his competitors have to look at that and figure out how they're going to combat that, because that's not going to be easy. Because the Red Bull isn't getting slower. Their competitors are getting a little faster, but the Red Bull isn't going backward. And so they're going to have a serious task ahead of them. This dude is the real deal. And more, every race that unfolds, I have to acknowledge and accept that this dude is the real deal. He is unbelievably good. Norris. So McLaren and Norris, I'm going to treat them combined. McLaren have made an astonishing step. They've made it, I think, in Miami, and since then it's proven itself. Low speed, which was their terrible weakness, they've got it. The car comes out of low speed corners like a bullet. And they did that, which is crucial, without sacrificing their high speed downforce and grip and cornering ability, which they already had and had very well. And basically they were a match for Red Bull in the high speed, but Red Bull was killing them in the low speed stuff. Now they've made that up. There's no question. And I would argue that they're probably just as kind, the McLaren chassis is just as kind to its tires as the Red Bull. And it's really more up to driver in how they manage the tire than any inherent flaw in the design of the car, in how it uses its tires. I think Lando drove very well. I think he was faster than Verstappen, and I think his time to shine is inevitable. I think it sounds weird to say this, but it's almost like it's unfortunate that he happens to be racing in the same era as Verstappen. Because I think without Max being there, Lando would be very much the man to beat. Because he really is driving well. And he even has, in a way, a similar driving style to Verstappen. He kind of is a short corner driver in a way, in the sense that, for those of us who don't necessarily understand that, he's not the last late braking type of guy. He actually turns in a little earlier, but what he does is he gets the car straight as early as he can and puts the power on very early and comes out of the corner hard. And that's one of Verstappen's strengths. And Lando is not too far off. I mean, he really is a good driver as well. But I think he's prone to error. I think he doubts himself. He probably lacks a little self-confidence, which comes from experience as well, or inexperience in his case. But he's gaining that, and so he's getting better. So I think as time passes, he's going to become a formidable competitor. And certainly before the end of this year, I expect him to have a couple more race wins on his belt. Max is definitely not going to have it all his way. I mean, he can't. Right now, Max is essentially relying on the errors of other drivers for him to benefit, because he doesn't have the fastest car anymore. And if the other people get it right on occasion, he's gonna struggle against them, and that's also a fact. Piastri, wow, didn't have a good race, didn't have a good qualifying. I think this is an anomaly. I think Piastri is really good. I don't think Norris is like miles ahead of Piastri by any means. And I think this was just an off. I don't know what happened. I can't say what was issues with setup or a track issue. I can't say. I guess maybe we'll eventually find out. But Piastri was just nowhere in this race. He didn't drive badly by any means, because he made up a good position. But he just wasn't a factor in the race. Mercedes, Hamilton. No, that's another story in itself. Mercedes and Hamilton and Russell. Mercedes, similar to McLaren, has made a tremendous leap. And they made it almost overnight. It seems like that front wing has dramatically transformed the car. This is no longer an anomaly, which again is kind of what I said about watching performance over a period of races to establish a trend rather than just looking at a one good or bad performance. There's no doubt that Mercedes is on an upward trajectory. Now I'm going to touch on that in a second when I contrast that to, for example, a Ferrari. But let's get back to the specifics. Hamilton drove superbly. In fairness to Russell, one, his pass at the beginning was just mind-blowing. Credit where credit is due. He's a super aggressive guy, and he's not afraid to take risks. It's both probably his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. When it fails spectacularly, and he goes from hero to zero, and probably takes out a few people with him. But on the other hand, when it works, we get what we saw on Sunday, which is just this incredible move from fourth to first, pulling out diagonally, moving left, making a wide arc, and just making Verstappen and Norris look like they're parked or driving in reverse. Brilliant pass. It had me screaming. I mean, I shouted so loud because I was so surprised, because I was focusing on the Norris and Verstappen battle. My eyes are focused on that part of the screen. I'm watching it on a really big 70-something inch TV, and I'm so focused on the part of the screen with Norris and Verstappen that when Russell just appeared out of nowhere and passed them, I literally just screamed at my dog. My dog was just in the room with me. He was so afraid, he got up and ran because I just laughed. It was crazy. I tell you, that was an incredible pass by Russell. Now, strangely, And I'm not the political type, so I'm not gonna get into the nonsense about sabotage with Hamilton because I don't believe that. I think there's many other issues that explain that. So I'll never accept that. That's a garbage argument. But one could reasonably argue that if there was any sabotage, it was against Russell in this race, because first off, he gets a 5 second pit stop from Mercedes, then he gets put on hards. I mean, that's just a terrible strategy call, and you don't need this issue of splitting strategy isn't always relevant if your two cars are fast. I can understand if you have a car that's fast and another one that's not, or that's qualified poorly and is starting from much further down in the grid than it should be, that you would want to split your strategy and hedge your bets in those scenarios. But when you have two guys that are up on the grid high and are both performing well, then you put both of them on the faster strategy and see how it plays out. I don't get that move by Mercedes by putting Russell on the hards, and obviously, it proved to be the bad one, and Hamilton could pass him quite easily towards the end. In fact, Leclerc was catching him. I think if the race was 1 or 2 laps longer, Leclerc would have probably passed Russell as well. So definitely a great improvement in chassis by by Mercedes. Great drive by Hamilton. Full credit where it's due. Great drive by Russell as well. But the team dropped the ball in the case of Russell. I think they could have done a lot better there. I think it would have been Russell third and Hamilton fourth had they not had the strategy mistake that they did. But anyway, it is what it is. Going a little further down the field to Ferrari. So let's look back now on what I mentioned about the trajectory thing with Mercedes being on an upward trajectory. Is this deja vu? Is this history repeating itself with Ferrari, where they start out well and then shoot themselves in the foot with some stupidity and end up going backward? Maybe a little too early to tell, but I will say that the signs are worrying. The signs are worrying. Ferrari seems to be on a downward trajectory. Now, this could be partially because of what is inevitably going to happen, which is internal strife between Sainz and Leclerc. And we see it happening now. And that's inevitable. And if Vasseur thought that wasn't going to happen based on the decision he made of firing Sainz and hiring Hamilton, then he's not an idiot. And that would be... I cannot imagine somebody like Vasseur not anticipating that this was an inevitable result, that there's going to be friction between the drivers. Because if Sainz is leaving, especially because he was fired, his loyalty is not going to be all that towards the team. But more importantly, he's not going to be doing his teammate any favors. He's there to make the best impression he can to impress other teams who may potentially hire him. And so, I find it can't be that Vasseur expected anything different. Now, to what extent that internecine rivalry is taking a toll on Ferrari itself, I don't know. But what I can say is Ferrari, which started out the year with a bang, and I thought were going to be Red Bull's main rivals, are nowhere for yet another race. I mean, Leclerc wasn't exactly slow, and as I said, I think he would have actually eventually caught Russell. But in the grand scheme of the race, certainly they wouldn't have been on the podium. And they were nowhere in practice and qualifying either. So it tells me that Ferrari is getting something wrong. And I'm hoping it's not a trend. If it is a trend, then Hamilton must be, I don't want to say worried, but he must be looking at Mercedes' performance now on the up and Ferrari's performance on the down, and be saying to himself, I don't know, that maybe that's an exaggeration, and maybe this is just a blip, maybe this is just an anomaly and Ferrari are going to find back their footing. But it does give me pause to think. I don't know. And I suspect in his quiet moments, it gives him a little pause as well. But we'll see. Let's not make any predictions. Again, 2 races don't make a trend. But I am a little worried about Ferrari because this track is a classic European track. It's a classic high speed, medium speed, low speed track with a decent surface. If your car is working well, it should work well here. And Ferrari brought a lot of upgrades. Let's not forget, Ferrari did bring upgrades. It's not like they just brought the same car. They brought upgrades and it didn't work. Don't want the video to get too long, so I'm going to try and summarize a couple of other things. Speaking of trajectories and you know, contrasting fortunes, let's quickly look at Alpine and VCarb. Alpine had a great race, 2 cars in the points, not bad at all. Look at VCarb, basically a new car, upgraded essentially everything, and they're nowhere. They've made a massive backward step, almost a Aston Martin-esque step backward. Crazy. Where did that come from? Haas and Williams, nowhere, battering around. I mean, Haas race wasn't the worst, but it wasn't great either. And Williams, you know, is nowhere. Again, I'll repeat, I don't know how effective Vols is. Maybe too early to tell, but I just don't get a good feel for that team. And it worries me that Sainz might be going there because he's a guy that I think deserves a good car. One of the things that worries me about the Williams project is if there's a lot of talk. You know, Vols is good and money is there and Mercedes engine and I worry that it's a lot of talk and not a lot of action. But time will tell. I stand to be corrected on that. And I'm not saying it in any absolute terms because I don't know. There's just too many variables. But I do have some question marks about where Williams is going and whether that would be the right place for Sainz to end up. VCarb, boy, crazy. That was just a disaster. I don't know what they did there. And whatever they did, they need to figure that out real fast because that must have been very demoralizing and demotivating for Tsunoda, particularly since he was having such a great year up to that point. I hope they turn that situation around and get it right. Sauber actually didn't do badly. Zhu had a decent race for the first in quite a while actually. Can't complain, not bad. I still don't think he's a great driver, but he acquitted himself well, and both of us was alright, you know. So overall, good race. I enjoyed it. Lots of nice strategies. Qualifying was good. Lando was superb. I mean, just on point. Overall, really nice race. Something to note going into the remainder of the season. I remember now we're looking at 3 races back-to-back, week after week in Europe. 3 fast races, Austria and Silverstone coming up. Verstappen has now used up all of his engine allotment. If he takes new engines from now onward, he's going to incur penalties, grid penalties. That's going to be interesting considering that we haven't even gotten to halfway through the season. So I think this season is very, very, very far from over. And considering that they no longer have the performance advantage that they had before, or in fact any performance advantage, and in some cases an even performance deficit, if he gets grid penalties, I think we're going to truly see the mettle of Verstappen probably for the first time, if he can really overcome some of these things and be what people actually think he is, which is, you know, really one of the greats. I think we have a very interesting season, and I'm looking forward to it. I think this is going to be really good. So let's see how it goes.